Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Lani Habrock here, your Government Affairs Director. Today, we are pivoting a little bit from talking with our regular candidates. Today, we're going to talk about something else that's going to be on your ballot. Excuse me. The state question 805, and this is a really exciting topic. It's going to be on everybody in the state's ballot, and we're all going to get a chance to vote on it. Today, we have with us a special guest, Nicole Mcafee. There's so much that we could talk about with Nicole today. A lot of our work intersects, but I'll go ahead and just kind of give you an introduction of who Nicole is. Her pronouns are she, her, hers. She's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the ACLU of Oklahoma. She joined the ACLU of Oklahoma in August of 2017 as a Smart Justice Campaign Manager. She graduated from Texas A&M University in 2011 with degrees in International Studies and French. Though her focus has long been foreign policy, Nicole felt compelled to do work closest to home where folks' basic civil liberties are at stake. She continues to be motivated by her passion for voter access and engagement, meaningful criminal legal reform, and working to elect officials who serve the interests of their constituents. She hopes one day Oklahoma will lead the nation, not in incarceration rate, but in solution-oriented work towards building a justice system that is truly restorative and equitable for all. Nicole, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I was so glad whenever you said that you could join us. I was rooting whenever I reached out to your campaign. I was like, I hope Nicole gets to be the one that I get to talk to. Well, let's just jump right into 805. So for those of us who are watching who may not be as familiar with that proposition, can you just give us kind of a brief overview of what it is?
Yeah, State Question 805 will be on the back of your ballot. It is the only citizen-led initiative petition state question to have qualified for the ballot this year. And it is an opportunity for voters to put the discretion of sentencing back in the hands of judges and juries by ending the use of repeat sentence penalties for nonviolent crimes in Oklahoma.
Can you explain to us what repeat sentencing is, and some people call it sentence enhancements? What does that mean?
Yeah, so any charge in the criminal code in Oklahoma has a sentencing range tied to it. So some level of minimum that can start at 0 or start at a set number of years, and a maximum of that range, so a floor and ceiling. But sort of also, if you have a previous conviction, prosecutors can push for sentence enhancements, which allow them to push beyond that sentence maximum. So when we look at Oklahoma's incarceration crisis, and based on recent Bureau of Justice statistics, we are back at the highest rate of incarceration in the country again. We not only incarcerate folks at a really high rate, our sentences are disproportionately long. And it's not only because the underlying sentencing ranges are so long, but because in 80% of eligible nonviolent cases, prosecutors use these enhancements to sentence above the maximum. And that means folks are spending extra years, extra decades, and up to life in prison because of past convictions they've already served time for.
So on the ground, this would look like if I have a DUI and then I get picked up for some other nonviolent offense, like say I had a warrant because I had an unpaid ticket, I could, instead of just having to pay that unpaid ticket, I might have to serve more jail time or pay more money because I also have a DUI. Is that what this gets rid of?
Yeah, it often looks at sort of the, I think especially over punishes the cycles of incarceration. So when we look at drivers of the prison population in Oklahoma, we are talking largely about nonviolent crimes and often about charges that are essentially criminalized poverty or criminalized substance use disorder, oftentimes both. And so when we are not sort of addressing those underlying front end problems that lead to the criminalized activity, and so someone gets picked up for a nonviolent, shoplifting charge because they don't have money for necessities for their kids, and then are later picked up for a similar charge after they've served their first sentence, because of that past conviction, it can add years, and the prosecutor can say, I'm now going to push beyond the maximum for this crime. And that becomes a problem really early on at the front end, because not only does it mean people are spending longer in prison, but it also means less of these cases are going to court. Because when a prosecutor is threatening to push for a really long sentence, it takes away a lot of your power in the plea bargaining process. And so that means that we're not really seeing justice served by a jury of your peers or by a judge. We're seeing people forced into really bad plea deals while they're being held in a dangerous jail pre-trial. And those are made all the worse by these sentence enhancements.
And so are sentence enhancements common throughout the United States and other states?
These repeat sentence penalties or sentence enhancements are an old sort of tough on crime era tactic. They do exist in other states, but we've also seen states sort of leave this practice behind. I will say, as we've looked into the state question and sort of the how and why they're used, in other states, they're often used at that front end, at the plea bargaining process, to force folks into the plea. But in only about 20% of cases are they actually used to add time. We use them in Oklahoma at the front end to force people into a plea, and also to add time above the maximum in about 80% of cases. We know that those longer sentences aren't a deterrent, that oftentimes they have worse outcomes because the longer you are in prison, the harder it is to return to your community, to return to the workforce. And so we are actually spending money the state doesn't have on outcomes we don't want. And we are hurting Oklahoma families and communities in the process.
Well, and this initiative, it does have some strong opposition, including from the governor's office. And the only somewhat compelling argument I've heard against it is opponents say that it could somehow negatively impact domestic violence situations. But I don't quite understand that, because domestic violence would be a violent crime, and 805 just doesn't look at non-violent sentencing. And I'm going to read you a quote from the executive director of the Oklahoma Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. They said, when abusers aren't held accountable, the violence escalates, and that's when they end up killing someone. In Oklahoma, we don't hold offenders accountable already, but whatever was there, State Question 805 will remove that, making it worse. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I will start by naming that domestic and interpersonal violence are sort of an ongoing crisis around the country, but especially in states like Oklahoma, we have some of the worst rates of folks subjected to harm by a partner or a member of their household. And we have the highest rate of incarceration, and we are not addressing that. I believe very much that we need to put resources into disrupting front-end harms of domestic and interpersonal violence, and we don't currently do that. But also really need to address how and where the criminal legal system responds. So there are some domestic violence charges in Oklahoma that are statutorily nonviolent. I will also say at the same time that prosecutors know good and well, and they often show this in the way we incarcerate folks, that there is no shortage of ways for them to put people in prison, and no shortage of ways for them to make that especially long time, even without repeat sentence penalties. And oftentimes when we look at lethality reports in Oklahoma, we're looking at scenarios where folks have committed a lethal act of domestic violence without ever being previously incarcerated. And the issue isn't our lack of carceral responses. It's oftentimes barriers to reporting, places that people feel safe and comfortable doing that. It's barriers like people being really afraid if they have children that they could end up in prison for failure to protect charges themselves. because they weren't able to escape an abusive situation earlier. We have a lot of barriers there. And not only do I believe that State Question 805 won't hurt people who are being subjected to domestic or interpersonal violence, I believe that opening up the $186 million in savings we expect to see allows us some real opportunity to put meaningful investments in disrupting that front end harm.
Absolutely. And so can you tell us a little bit about the impact of what State Question 805 will have on Oklahoma should it pass, the positive impacts?
Yeah. So as I said, there was a sort of savings impact report done. And we expect if, yes, on State Question 805 passes, that the state over the next several years will see a savings of about $186 million. And that is both because going forward, we are looking at shorter sentences more in line with sentences around the rest of the country. So we don't have these disproportionately long sentences for nonviolent charges. And I think State Question 805 also does something important that we've missed in past criminal justice reform state questions. So when State Question 780 passed, it was prospective. So going forward, there were changes made, but it didn't allow any room to correct what voters agreed were disproportionately long sentences and unnecessary felony records for folks who, if they were arrested later, would no longer serve prison time. And so because of that, we saw a long legislative effort that became House Bill 1269 and resulted in the largest commutation in U.S. history, with about 500 folks sort of and counting being released from Oklahoma prisons. And so State Question 805 took that into account and includes an option for folks who are currently sentenced to petition the court for release. So it's not an automatic valve. There's still discretion from the courts available. But people who are currently serving above a sentence maximum because of these repeat sentence penalties for crimes that are all nonviolent will be eligible to see an earlier release date. And so that'll have some savings as well. And ultimately, I think anytime we're talking about impact, right, that the fiscal impact is sort of the easiest thing to measure. But the human impact matters a lot too. We know that Oklahoma has the highest rate of incarceration for women in the country. We also know since 2014, Oklahoma has led the nation in per capita incarceration rate of Black people. And that between the years 2008 and 2015, we saw a 46% increase in the rate of Indigenous people incarcerated in Oklahoma. And so we are talking about specifically Black and Indigenous communities seeing folks returned home. We are talking about people who are trapped in the revolving door of the prison system because of substance use disorder, because of mental health conditions, because of poverty, having the opportunity to serve less time in prison and hopefully see more resources opened up as a result of an opportunity to reevaluate where and how we spend that money. And we know that the average woman in Oklahoma's carceral system has more than 2 children at home. So we are talking about a lot of families being reunited, a lot of grandparents who are serving as primary caretakers, having a little bit of that burden lifted off of their shoulders. And so I think that this is, a women's issue. It is a racial justice issue. It is a family issue, and it is a criminal justice reform issue. And that is why I am excited and enthusiastically supporting State Question 805.
Amazing. Yeah, I really appreciate that you bring up the generational impact that something like this can have on families. You mentioned that this is the only state question on the ballot that was people approved. So in your work, the grassroots work, kind of what did you see on the ground? Are people really passionate about this topic?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. So Oklahoma has two ways for state questions to land on the ballot. We have an additional state question that was drafted by the legislature and approved through the legislative process and put on the ballot. And then state question 805, which was a process where citizens, Oklahoma voters, filed the state question, pushed out a process through initiative petitions to get hundreds of thousands of signatures. And I'll note, did that in a shorter timeline than usual because that was disrupted by the start of sort of COVID on the ground in Oklahoma. So there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm around that process, and I think I've seen that continue. But I think what's most important to name with a state question like this is it is so hard because oftentimes the people most impacted by this change have the least power in being able to move it. We know that despite changes by champions like Representative Regina Goodwin to try to change language around felony disenfranchisement and voting, that there are a lot of people who are no longer incarcerated but are still unable to vote because of the way that we've written that law. We also know that folks incarcerated and held both pretrial and in Oklahoma prisons are unable to vote. And that means the people who are going to see the most relief from this are sort of furthest removed from being able to take that action. And so I always take that seriously as we see so many of those advocates being really bold and brave in this process and getting sort of attacked as a result. We've seen a lot of opposition share people's sort of mugshots and conviction histories in ways that they try to make really damaging to sort of share people's worst days or years of their lives on social media. And those folks oftentimes have still sort of shown back up and told their stories because they are resilient and because they don't get a vote, but they know it's so important that other folks really understand why we need to vote yes on the state question.
And criminal justice reform has been such an important topic, especially for our state. As you mentioned, our incarceration rates are off the charts and we lead the world in some of our stats. Beyond state question 805, how do you recommend that people can continue to get involved and to make a difference?
Yeah, I think that state question 805 is on the November 3rd ballot, that we work our hardest to get a win there. And that means making calls and reaching out to our networks and informing people about what it is and what it does and urging them to vote yes. But that as soon as election day is over, the work is still there and the crisis is still there.
Absolutely.
I think sort of in immediate things, we have seen just huge outbreaks of COVID spread in Oklahoma prisons. I think we're well over 3,000 folks who are currently incarcerated right now who have already tested COVID positive in the prison system. We have hundreds more currently positive, in addition to about 4,000 people currently quarantined, and more than a dozen who have died as a result of COVID in prison. Being advocates in those spaces is critical. Most states, when presented with the fact that COVID was going to spread just wildly and quickly throughout their system, did a lot of work to reduce the prison population and reduce the pretrial population. And Oklahoma did not really do that and has still not done that. And so reaching out to Department of Corrections Director Scott Crow, to Governor Stitt, to the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, and encouraging them to hear more medical parole dockets, I think is a really urgent step that folks can take and can be as simple as an email or a letter or phone call. Reaching out to your local DA and county commissioners and local sheriff and asking them about the pretrial detention population in the jail, because we've seen COVID outbreaks in jails too with much less reporting. Even just yesterday, I think we are now over 80 folks in the Tulsa County Jail who currently are COVID positive. And we know that on any given day, about 70% of folks in jails throughout the US are there pretrial because they can't afford an arbitrary amount of money bail tied to their charge. And we know in several Oklahoma jails that number is higher, something like 80% on most days in Oklahoma County Jail. And so really letting folks with power know that you're watching them and advocate for more people being released on OR bond so that they are not being held in this really dangerous situation where they are likely to get sick because there aren't really ways to mitigate against the spread of COVID in a packed prisoner jail facility, but that we very much have power there. And then being ready to fight in legislative session. We expect that there may be some sort of sentencing guideline reform change from the Attorney General's Reclassification Council. And the only drafts that they've shared of that so far violate their sort of legislative authority that holds the body together, which is they are supposed to create a sentencing structure that either maintains the level of incarceration or reduces the rate of incarceration in Oklahoma. And everything that they've produced so far would only grow it. And I think that we've got to be ready both to fight against things like that, but also to fight for meaningful changes like bail reform and jury sentencing instruction. That there's a lot we can do. There's no shortage of it. And folks from across the political spectrum are engaged in this work. OCPA and Americans for Prosperity and the ACLU of Oklahoma and Oklahoma Policy Institute, Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. You can pick the organization that you want to reach out to and engage in this fight with. There's a lot of opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I could talk with you all day about the many different things that we can do to make Oklahoma a better place to live. I do want to say CAIR Oklahoma has officially come out and endorsed State Question 805. If you would like to read more about CAIR Oklahoma's stance, as well as the different arguments for and against this very important initiative, you can go to cairoklahoma.com and see our State Question Guide. We also talk about the other State Question 814 that is going to be on the ballot as well. I want to thank Nicole Mcafee so much for joining us today and just sharing all of your wisdom and really teaching us all things. I learned some things today as well, and just really sharing your passion with us. I'll give you the last word. Do you have any words of encouragement or hope for the people out there?
We are in the final few days to the election. It'll be here before we know it, mere weeks away. But Oklahomans are already voting. There are a lot of folks that have absentee ballots in hand. And I would encourage you, I would love for it to be with Yes on 805, but it can be with a candidate you care about or an organization you care about to really get involved in encouraging voter engagement this year. You can go to yeson805.org to sign up for volunteer shifts, to get fact sheets to share with folks you know. But I think, as is always the case with whatever election is before us, this is the most important election of our lifetimes. And we want to make sure that everybody is enfranchised and uses their vote. So would really encourage you to be a part of that effort.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us. We hope you have an amazing week and don't forget to vote.